The clock struck midnight as Daniel sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the faint hum of the fridge blending with the silence. His phone buzzed, a voicemail playing on its own. A trembling voice whispered, "They know where you are," before static swallowed the words. Daniel froze, his breath shallow as the sound cut through him like glass. He whispered, "Who are you?" But the room gave no answer. Then, from the alley outside, a scream pierced the night, shrill and desperate, echoing through the street. Daniel rushed to the window, his pulse racing, but the sidewalk was empty. Only shadows stretched under the flickering streetlight. He grabbed his jacket, muttering, "This can't be happening." As he stepped outside, the wind shifted, curling around his ears with a chilling hiss, almost forming words. His eyes locked on a small silver pendant lying on the ground. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, shimmering faintly. Daniel picked it up, whispering, "What is this?" And the air answered with a voice carried by the wind, soft and cryptic, "Truth waits in silence." Daniel returned inside, shutting the door quickly, his heart thundering. He locked it twice, pressing his back against the wood as the wind rattled the glass. The pendant felt heavy in his hand, its strange markings glowing faintly as though alive. He whispered, "This doesn't make sense," but even his own voice sounded foreign in the silence. A soft hum carried through the room, almost like a voice hidden in static. He placed the pendant on the table, staring at it, afraid to touch it again. The voicemail replayed in his mind, the chilling words gnawing at him. He whispered, "Who knows where I am?" His eyes darted toward the window, half expecting someone to be standing there. The room grew colder, and the shadows deepened, pressing against him. He muttered, "I need answers," but part of him already feared the truth. The night dragged on, silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of old wood. Daniel poured himself a glass of water, his hand shaking as droplets spilled onto the counter. He stared at his reflection in the darkened window, but his own eyes seemed unfamiliar, distant. The pendant remained on the table, its faint glow casting shifting patterns across the clutter. He muttered, "I didn't ask for this," and rubbed his temples. The memory of the scream outside clawed at him. He whispered, "Was someone hurt?" He wanted to believe it was a prank, yet deep down, he knew it was real. The whisper of the wind seemed to answer, rattling the window pane in sharp bursts, as though in reply. Sleep was impossible. Daniel paced the narrow hallway, the pendant's glow now etched into his mind. Every shadow looked alive, every creak felt like footsteps trailing him. He whispered, "I need to know what this means." His thoughts replayed the words, "They know where you are," again and again. He imagined unseen eyes watching him from the darkness, their silence louder than any scream. The wind whistled faintly through a gap in the window frame, curling into syllables that almost formed words. Daniel stopped, listening hard, his skin prickling. For the first time, he asked the night itself, "What do you want from me?" The silence that followed felt deliberate, suffocating, like an answer he wasn't ready to hear. Hours later, Daniel collapsed onto the couch, exhausted but unable to rest. He stared at the ceiling, thoughts racing in spirals. The pendants glowed dim slightly, but the symbols seemed to shift when he blinked. He muttered, "It's changing." His body trembled with fear and fatigue, yet he couldn't ignore the weight of what was unfolding. The wind pressed faintly against the window, whispering just beyond hearing. Daniel sat up sharply, heart pounding, convinced it was calling his name. He whispered, "This is madness," but inside he knew something far bigger than himself had already begun. The silence returned, heavier than before, and Daniel realized he was no longer alone, even in his own home. Morning broke, but Daniel felt no relief. He hadn't slept, his eyes red and hollow. The pendant lay on the table, dull now, yet its presence still heavy. He muttered, "I can't ignore this anymore." The silence pressed down on him, making even the hum of the city outside feel distant. He decided to call Emily, the only person he trusted, though even that felt dangerous. As the phone rang, his chest tightened. When she answered, Her voice was warm yet cautious. "Daniel, you sound shaken." He whispered, "Something happened last night." He wanted to explain, but fear gripped him. Emily urged, "Come over. Don't stay alone." For a moment, he hesitated, staring at the pendant, then nodded to himself. He whispered, "I'll be there soon." The air stirred faintly, almost as if answering him. Daniel walked through the quiet streets, early sunlight spilling over rooftops. The world seemed normal, yet every step felt watched. His thoughts replayed the scream from the night before, gnawing at his resolve. He whispered, "Why me?" His grip tightened around the pendant in his pocket, the symbols faintly warm against his skin. Passing an alley, he felt the wind brush his ear, carrying a whisper he couldn't quite understand. His heart raced as he muttered, "I'm not imagining this." A figure stood across the street, too far to see clearly, watching him. When Daniel blinked, the figure was gone. He hurried forward, muttering, "Keep walking," his voice shaking, fear clawing at him as the city stirred awake around him. At Emily's apartment, Daniel hesitated at the door before knocking. She opened it quickly, concern etched across her face. Emily, 29, auburn hair tied back, eyes sharp with worry, pulled him inside. She said, "Tell me what happened." Daniel sat at her table, placing the pendant before them. The strange symbols shimmered faintly in the daylight. Emily's breath caught. "Where did you get this?" Daniel's voice cracked. "It was outside my building, after I heard a scream." Her expression hardened, fear flickering beneath it. She whispered, "I've seen these before." Daniel's stomach twisted as he demanded, "What do you mean?" Emily shook her head, her voice low. "Not here. It's not safe." Daniel leaned forward, his voice trembling. "Emily, you have to tell me." She glanced at the window nervously before answering. When I was a child, I saw these symbols in my father's old journals," she said. Her tone was heavy with memory. Daniel asked, "What did they mean?" Emily shook her head slowly. He never explained, but he was terrified of them. Daniel stared at the pendant, his gut churning. "So this isn't random," he muttered. Emily's voice dropped. "No. It's connected to something much bigger." The wind pressed faintly against the glass as though listening. Daniel whispered, "Why is it finding me?" Emily's eyes flickered with unease, and for the first time, she seemed afraid of him. The air grew heavier as silence stretched between them. Emily whispered, "You shouldn't have brought it here." Daniel's voice cracked. "I didn't know where else to go." She stood, pacing the room, her arms wrapped tight around herself. "If my father was right, then this means someone has already marked you." Daniel's breath hitched. "Marked me? For what?" Emily shook her head, her voice tight. "I don't know. But it's not just you anymore. By coming here, you've put me in this too." Daniel's chest tightened with guilt as he whispered, "I didn't mean to drag you in." The pendant shimmered faintly on the table, and the window rattled as the wind whispered words neither of them dared to understand. The library was hushed, its tall windows glowing with afternoon light. Daniel and Emily sat at a wooden table covered in dusty town records. "What?" Daniel whispered. "We need to know what these symbols mean." Emily traced her finger over a brittle page, her eyes narrowing. She muttered, "Here, they're here too." The markings etched across an old map mirrored the pendant's design. Daniel leaned closer, his voice tight. "It's the same pattern." Emily's hand trembled as she whispered, "It marks burial sites. Unrecorded graves." Daniel's chest tightened. The air grew heavier as silence pressed in. He whispered, "This isn't just history. It's something they wanted buried." Emily looked up at him, fear etched across her face, and the wind outside rattled the glass as though in warning. Hours passed as the two pored through records. Dust rose in thin clouds each time a book opened. Emily muttered, "These files are decades old." Daniel's eyes scanned faded ink, his pulse racing as he whispered, "This town's been hiding something." Emily's lips pressed tight. "My father was right to fear this." A sudden draft swept through the aisles, scattering loose papers across the floor. Daniel muttered, The wind again, his voice uneasy. Emily whispered, "It's following us." Her words hung heavy in the silence, and Daniel's grip on the pendant in his pocket tightened until his knuckles whitened. He whispered, "If we're being watched, we can't stay here long." The library seemed to close in on them with every passing second. Emily pulled an old journal from a shelf, her hand trembling. She opened it to reveal sketches of the same strange symbols. She whispered, "This was my father's handwriting." Daniel leaned in, his voice sharp, so he knew all along. Emily's eyes filled with fear. "He tried to warn me, but I didn't understand." Daniel scanned the entries, words smudged with age, and muttered, "These aren't warnings, they're records." He flipped through pages showing names, dates, and strange diagrams. Emily's voice cracked. He was tracking them. Daniel's jaw tightened, then someone silenced him. The library creaked, floorboards groaning as if something unseen shifted in the shadows. "Wow," Daniel whispered. "We're not alone here," and Emily's hands clutched the journal tighter. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly between the shelves. Daniel froze, whispering, "Did you hear that?" Emily nodded, her eyes wide, clutching the journal tightly against her chest. Daniel stood slowly, scanning the aisles, but no one appeared. The silence was heavy, almost deliberate, broken only by the soft rattle of a window pane. Emily whispered, "We need to go." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Not yet. There's something else here." He walked down the aisle, shadows stretching unnaturally along the books. The pendant in his pocket pulsed faintly, warmth spreading through the fabric. His breath quickened. Emily called softly, "Daniel, please," her voice edged with panic. The library groaned again, as though the building itself carried a memory it couldn't keep hidden. Daniel reached the far end of the library and stopped before a locked cabinet. Its glass pane was cracked, dust coating the handle. He whispered, "Why lock this away?" Emily approached slowly, journal in hand, eyes dotting nervously. Daniel tugged at the handle, and it gave way with a sharp creak. Inside, bundles of photographs and letters spilled out. Daniel lifted one, his breath catching. It showed the same pendant clutched by a man in uniform decades ago. Emily gasped. "That's him, my father." Daniel's voice dropped. He wasn't just studying them. He was part of it. The wind surged violently through the broken window, scattering the documents across the floor as though to bury the truth once again. Daniel and Emily left the library with hurried steps, clutching the journal and scattered notes. The sky had grown gray, heavy clouds rolling in with the weight of a storm. Emily whispered, "We can't trust anyone with this." Daniel's jaw tightened as he replied, "Then we keep moving until we know who's behind it." The street seemed emptier than usual, every window watching. A patrol car slowed as it passed, its headlights cutting through the mist. Daniel muttered, "They're already looking for us." Emily gripped the journal tighter, her eyes darting nervously. The pendant in Daniel's pocket pulsed faintly as though alive. A voice on the wind slithered past his ear, whispering words too faint to understand. He shivered, muttering, "It doesn't want us to stop." They slipped into a diner at the edge of town, neon lights buzzing faintly against the storm-dark sky. Inside, the smell of stale coffee and grease filled the air. A man in uniform sat at the counter, his back to them. Emily whispered, "Keep your head down." Daniel's eyes flicked to the door, nerves sharp. They slid into a booth, keeping their voices low. Daniel muttered, "We need someone who knows more." Emily replied, "There is someone." Her voice trembled as she added, "But I don't know if we can trust him." The pendant pulsed faintly, glowing beneath the table as the wind rattled the diner's thin windows. Daniel's breath caught. "Then we don't have a choice," he whispered. Emily leaned close, her voice a whisper. "There's a man named Richard, my father's old friend. He knew about the symbols, but he disappeared years ago." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "If he's still around, he's hiding for a reason." Emily nodded slowly. "He's the only one who might help us." A waitress passed by, eyeing them curiously, and Daniel forced a faint smile. As soon as she walked away, his voice lowered. If he's alive, he won't trust strangers. Emily replied firmly. He'll trust me. The pendant shifted in Daniel's pocket, as though reacting to the name. The wind outside roared suddenly, shaking the window so hard, the glass nearly cracked. Daniel whispered. Then we find him tonight. Night fell as they left the diner, rain pouring hard against the pavement. The storm turned streets into rivers of silver. Emily held the journal under her coat, her eyes sharp with determination. Daniel whispered, Where would Richard hide? Emily pointed down a side road. He used to stay in an old farmhouse outside town. Lightning split the sky, and for a moment Daniel thought he saw a figure standing at the corner, watching them. When he blinked, it was gone. His voice shook. We're being followed. Emily quickened her pace. Then we need to move faster. Thunder cracked above as they disappeared into the storm, the pendant glowing faintly like a beacon through the darkness. The farmhouse stood at the edge of a field, its windows boarded, roof sagging under years of neglect. The rain poured harder, soaking them as they approached. Daniel whispered, Are you sure this is it? Emily nodded, her voice shaking. He used to meet my father here. Daniel pushed the door open, wood groaning under his weight. Inside, dust and cobwebs thickened the air. A lantern flickered faintly in the corner, though no one was there to light it. Emily's breath caught. Someone's here. Daniel's hand brushed the pendant, and it pulsed like a heartbeat. A low creak echoed upstairs. Emily whispered, We're not alone, her voice barely audible. Daniel's jaw tightened as he muttered, Then we've already been found. The farmhouse groaned under the storm's weight, rain hammering the roof as Daniel and Emily crept upstairs. Each step moaned with age. Emily whispered, He has to be here. At the end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar, a faint light spilling from inside. Daniel gripped the pendant as his pulse quickened. He pushed the door open and froze. A man sat in the corner, bearded, eyes sharp with suspicion. Emily gasped, Richard. Richard rose slowly, voice harsh. You shouldn't have come. Daniel muttered, We need answers. Richard's gaze locked on the pendant, his face hardening. That thing will kill you, he growled. The air grew heavier, the wind pressing through cracks in the walls, carrying a low whisper as though agreeing with him. Richard stepped closer, his face drawn and weathered. You brought danger here, he said coldly. Emily's voice trembled. You knew my father. You know what this means. Richard's jaw tightened, eyes flicking between her and the pendant. Your father was a fool, he spat. He thought he could stop them. Daniel snapped. Stop who? Richard's expression darkened. The ones who marked you. Once it begins, it doesn't end. The pendant glowed faintly in Daniel's hand, and Richard recoiled as though burned. Emily whispered, You're afraid of it. Richard's eyes burned with anger. Afraid? No. I survived it, and I'll never let it touch me again. The storm outside howled, rattling the walls violently. The lantern flickered as Richard paced the room. You think you found a clue, he muttered. But it's a trap. Emily shot back, You're hiding something. Richard froze, his silence louder than words. Daniel whispered, He knows more than he's saying. Richard's fists clenched. If you stay, you'll die like the rest, he growled. Emily's eyes blazed with anger. The rest? Who else? Richard's gaze dropped, shadows deepening his expression. Your father, Emily. He wasn't silenced. He chose it. Daniel's chest tightened, disbelief sharp in his voice. You're lying. Richard's voice cracked with bitter truth. He joined them. Storm thundered outside as Emily staggered back, her face pale with shock. Emily shook her head, tears filling her eyes. No, he tried to protect me. Richard's voice was low and bitter. He protected himself. The rest of us paid the price. Daniel stepped forward, fury in his eyes. Then why are you still alive? Richard's gaze hardened. Because I obeyed their rules. Emily's voice broke. You're lying. You knew him. You fought with him. Richard's expression cracked for a moment, sorrow flickering before anger returned. He chose them. I chose survival. Daniel whispered, And now you're choosing to betray us too. The pendant glowed brighter, illuminating Richard's face with harsh light. For the first time, his expression faltered, fear etched deep into his weathered features. Suddenly, footsteps echoed below. Richard's head snapped toward the stairs, his voice sharp. "They're here." Emily's face drained of color as she whispered, "Who?" Richard's eyes locked on Daniel, rage and fear mingling. "You led them to us." Daniel's pulse surged, his voice shaking. "We didn't bring anyone." Richard grabbed a shotgun from the corner, his hands steady despite his age. "You don't understand. Once they mark you, they never stop." Emily clutched Daniel's arm, whispering, "We have to go." Richard stepped in front of the door, blocking their path, voice harsh. "No. Leaving now means death. Staying might give you a chance." The storm roared louder, and the wind's whisper grew into a voice that seemed to call Daniel's name. The floorboards shuddered as someone forced the front door. Daniel's breath hitched, and the pendant warmed like a living ember. Richard hissed, "Basement, now." Emily clutched the journal and nodded. They moved fast, boots thundering on the stairs above them. A crash split the house, and glass rained like ice. Daniel whispered, "We're trapped." Richard knelt by a rusted hatch and pried it open. Wind pushed through the cracks and formed a faint word. It sounded like a name only Daniel could hear. Emily said, "Say it out loud." Daniel shook his head, afraid it would invite something closer. Boards groaned, and a flashlight beam swept the hall. Richard growled, "Down there, or we're done." Daniel slid into the dark and cold earth swallowed his knees. Emily followed, breath sharp, and Richard lowered the hatch as footsteps reached the door. They hunched in the crawl space as footsteps crossed the room above. Dust sifted down in gentle streams. Emily whispered, "If they find the hatch, we're done." Richard lifted a finger for silence. Daniel felt the pendant pulse in a slow rhythm. The wind funneled through a vent and shaped a soft phrase. It matched a line from the journal he had scanned earlier. Daniel murmured, 3 turns left, 1 right." Richard shot him a look. Daniel added, "It's a code for an old lock." Richard nodded grimly and crawled deeper. He found a corroded panel and brushed away dirt. A hidden latch waited in shadow. He turned it 3 times left and once right. The wall sighed and shifted. A narrow tunnel exhaled cold air that smelled like stone and secrets. They slipped into the tunnel as the hatch creaked above. Voices muttered in clipped tones. The tunnel narrowed, and the air turned thin. Emily whispered, "If we lose the journal, we lose everything." Daniel said, "I'll carry it if you need a hand." She shook her head, stubborn and afraid. Richard moved with surprising speed, counting steps under his breath. The wind pressed through unseen gaps and carried a clearer phrase. Daniel recognized the cadence from the voicemail. He spoke softly, "The truth waits in silence." The tunnel bent and pale light bloomed ahead. A steel door stood in a small chamber, its face engraved with the same pattern as the pendant. Richard said, "This is where it always ended for me." Daniel answered, "Then this time, it opens." Daniel raised the pendant and felt it vibrate with the door's pulse. Emily read from the journal in a thin whisper. Richard stood guard, shotgun low and ready. The door did not budge. Daniel closed his eyes and listened to the wind beyond the vent. The same voice that warned him now threaded a final code. He repeated it in a steady tone. The door clicked, then locked harder. Emily gasped, "It wants a choice." Daniel swallowed as a second mechanism hummed. A gauge bled toward red. Richard barked, "It's a purge system." Pipes hissed behind the walls. Daniel heard the wind say one more word that sounded like a name. If he pursued the full reveal, the system would flood the chamber. If he shut it down, the records might vanish forever. Emily said, "Choose fast." Daniel pressed his palm to the door and spoke the phrase the wind delivered. He added one word that only the voicemail had held. The gauge stalled at the edge. He turned and met Emily's eyes. He said, "I can unlock it, but it triggers a burn." Emily shook her head, torn between fear and duty. Richard said, "The files kill towns. Save the living." The pipe screamed as pressure built. Daniel breathed once, and chose. He diverted the purge to the corridor behind them, sealing the tunnel to buy seconds. The door opened a hand's width and spilled a stack of microfilm canisters. Alarms howled above. Daniel grabbed the canisters and shoved them into Emily's pack. He said, "Run." The wind carried a final whisper that sounded like a warning and a promise. Daniel, Emily, and Richard stumbled out of the tunnel into the storm, lungs burning from smoke and dust. The farmhouse shuddered behind them, alarms echoing from deep underground. Daniel gasped, "They'll come for us now." Emily clutched the pack tight, the canisters pressing into her chest. She whispered, "We have proof, but no one to trust." Richard raised his shotgun and scanned the tree line, growling, "They'll silence anyone who sees this." Lightning lit the sky, and for an instant Daniel thought he saw shadowed figures moving between the trees. He whispered, "They're closer than we thought." The pendant glowed faintly, as though feeding on his fear, and the wind carried a whisper that felt almost like laughter. They reached an abandoned church on the edge of town, its steeple broken and windows shattered. Inside, candle stubs littered the altar. Emily whispered, "We can't keep running forever." Daniel set the pendant on the cracked stone and muttered, "We need to know what's on these reels." Richard shook his head. "The moment we open them, they'll know." Emily's voice trembled, "If we stay blind, we'll never win." The wind pressed through the broken glass and carried a long hiss, almost forming words. Daniel said, "It's telling me to wait." Emily slammed the pack on the altar. "No, it's time to decide." Emily threaded the first reel onto an old projector she found in a storage room. The machine sputtered, but came alive with a low hum. Grainy film spilled across the cracked wall, showing faces of men and women in uniforms. Daniel whispered, "They built this." Emily pointed at the pendant symbol burned into every document. This was never a myth. Richard's face tightened as he recognized names scrawled across the frames. He muttered, "These people still live here." The projector flickered, showing rows of marked graves with the same symbols etched in stone. Emily's voice cracked. They buried their secrets in plain sight. The wind roared through the rafters like a scream, shaking the church violently. The church doors slammed open with the force of the storm. Shadowed figures entered, flashlights cutting sharp beams through the dust. Richard raised his shotgun, shouting, "Go!" Emily grabbed the pack, pulling Daniel toward the back hall. Pendant glowed hot in his hand, the symbols burning brighter than ever. Daniel whispered, "It wants me to stay." Emily shouted, "Ignore it." Richard fired, the sound deafening, as splinters flew from the doorframe. Daniel stumbled, torn between the voice in the wind and the people at his side. For the first time, the whisper carried his name clearly, soft but commanding. His heart froze as he realized it was the same voice from the voicemail. They fled into the storm, the church collapsing behind them under gunfire and lightning. Daniel clutched the pendant, its glow fading slowly. Emily stumbled, clutching the reels, her voice ragged. "We have the truth, but it will cost us everything." Richard staggered behind, bleeding from his arm, growling, "Keep moving." Daniel's breath came hard, his chest burning, but the whisper on the wind followed still. It carried a final phrase, one he had never heard before. "Not finished." He froze, staring into the storm, his heart sinking. Emily tugged his arm, crying, "Daniel, don't stop." He turned once more to the wind, eyes hollow, and whispered back, "Then neither am I."